Hermann Ebbinghaus is remembered mostly for discovering the forgetting curve. But did he really discover it first? Well, if you open any psychology textbook or read any blog devoted to some sort of spaced repetition app, they'll tell you that he was the one who discovered it. And in a certain sense, of course, he did. He named it the Vergessene Kurve, I think you say in German. And it's just a really interesting study that he did for reasons we'll talk about in this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. But the reality is that it's older than that. And what is old about the forgetting curve can teach you a lot about how to use memory techniques in an optimal way that gets you a better result. Now, the forgetting curve led to this very, very famous graph that you've probably seen. And famous, I mean, in our world of learning faster, using memory techniques, study methods, etc. We often see this curve, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but Tony Buzan thought this was a very, very important curve. He, in fact, called it the most important graph in the world. And I think he's maybe right about that. I mean, even though I'm going to suggest to you today and show you that the forgetting curve was known about long before Ebbinghaus, it is a very, very important graph, and it's one that has really, really helped scientists take memory techniques much more seriously. And to this day, the research that Ebbinghaus brought to the forgetting curve is still reproducible. And there was a reproducibility crisis in science where a lot of studies were just not working out according to the description of previous studies, and the forgetting curve was not touched by this at all. It still worked, and so did the serial positioning effect that comes along with it that helps us beat the forgetting curve. But with memory techniques, we can beat it even better and more reliably, depending on some factors that we'll talk about today in some detail. So this is Dr. Anthony Metivier. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast from magneticmemorymethod.com. And I'm going to cover these aspects of the forgetting curve after never having done an article in all these years or a podcast about the forgetting curve very, very specifically. Now, there's some reasons for that are boring and not worth mentioning, but the reason why I'm doing it now is because in the past year or so, I've had so many younger people emailing me about anxieties they're having, and they're using scientific language to express their worries and concerns about using memory techniques in ways that's just creating perfectionism that is absolutely unnecessary. And I think they're misplacing. I think they're really understanding the memory science, but I think they're misplacing it in their practice, because there's a difference between practicing memory techniques and using all kinds of scientific language to describe it or to discuss it. So this is something that's very, very important to me, and I think it's time to really throw down the gloves and put the forgetting curve in its place, especially since I've spent decades memorizing poetry, scripture, mantras in Sanskrit, complex terminology in a variety of fields, and I've taught these techniques to people for a very, very long time. And, treated correctly, the forgetting curve is an invitation to success, not anything to have worries about or anxieties about. But for the uninitiated who have never heard about it, let's get into what exactly is the forgetting curve, in case that this term is interesting to you and you're joining us for this discussion, but you don't quite know what it is. So in 1885, Ebbinghaus published Über das Gedächtnis in German, which is often translated in English, Memory, a Contribution to Experimental Psychology. And notice that term, experimental psychology. This really, really matters. And that's why it's such a monumental work, because Ebbinghaus reported on years and years and years of experiments he had run on really a very, very singular focus when it comes to memory techniques, or memory itself, better said. He focused on memorizing nonsense syllables, or sinnlose Silben, I think they're called in German. Sinnlose means senseless, I think, and Silben is syllable. And these were consonant-vowel combinations that were usually three letters, like Zoff and Keb and Beck. And, they'd be forward and backwards. So Zoff would be Foz and Keb would be Beck and all this sort of stuff. And then he would test his retention of these nonsense words. But he would also, after he had started to forget them, he would test how much effort it took him to re-memorize them after various delays. So we need to think about this in all of its different dimensions. The words were made up, for one thing. They were invented words, nothing with any meaning. Now, in some senses, it can be easier to memorize things that have no meaning because you just have to memorize the sound. You don't have to bring meaning along with it. However, because it's just meaningless and has no context, that could make it more difficult. I don't know if there's a real answer there. I think there's some elements of your personal tolerance that have to come into play here. But the idea that Ebbinghaus not only learned and then forgot words, but then relearned them is really, really important because you often don't hear this talked about. What he would do is he would also measure what he called the savings. And this is really, really important because, you can read a really interesting study. It's called Why Ebbinghaus's Savings Method from 1885 is a very pure measure of memory performance. But just to briefly give you the gist of what this article is all about, let's just suppose that you took 20 repetitions to learn a list of nonsense words. And it only then took 10 repetitions to relearn that same list later. Well, what this means is that some trace of your original learning remained. And this suggests something absolutely fascinating, which is that an inability to remember information perfectly, but then to relearn it faster than you learned it the first time around, well, there must have been some kind of trace left behind. And I don't know exactly where this is all going to go in the future, but other studies come up. And recently we talked to Dr. Paul Garrett on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast about his research into fuzzy memories and how fuzzy memories help us recall information more than it might seem at first glance. And also, I think of Richard Zeman, who had things like, or concepts like ekphory and the engram, and he was talking about traces in memory. So those are really important concepts to think about because it tells us a lot about what we could potentially do by learning and then relearning things. And we often just don't spend enough time relearning things. Years ago, I had a podcast episode, I should redo it actually, on why you should reread a book, at least one book, every single month. And I think that maybe intuitively, I hadn't discovered Richard Zeman by that point, or engrams, or ekphory, or anything related to the fuzzy memory research by Dr. Paul Garrett that only came out recently. But it's just really, really important because you end up, when you reread stuff, not only noticing things you missed before, but remembering new aspects of it with greater ease. All right, so back to Ebbinghaus. His experiments, as we know now, are called the forgetting curve, or they have revealed what we call the forgetting curve. And what it shows is that retention drops very, very steeply at first. So a lot of people email me all the time. They say, well, I started using these memory techniques and then I forgot stuff right away. And I say, well, how long did you use the memory techniques? What memory techniques are you using? And they'll usually say something like, well, I tried for 3 or 4 days. And then, that's not long enough to fight the forgetting curve because that curve is very, very steep. And so you need to learn how to use memory techniques longer than that. And you also need to learn something else that Ebbinghaus discovered, which is the spacing effect. And it describes how the review process distributed over time will help you preserve more information in long-term memory. So 3 to 4 days of trying memory techniques to beat the forgetting curve just can't cut it, right? But again, Ebbinghaus needs more nuance than just the idea that he memorized all these nonsense syllables and then relearned them and tested various aspects to it. I think the point that gets lost time and time again that's so important is that Ebbinghaus was an n=1 memorizer. And N is, subject, and one means one subject in the study. So this is really, really important. He had skin in the game, for one thing, and he memorized material in his own mind. He wasn't a scientist removed from the project. And this is something that I took as both a lesson and an inspiration. I remember reading a book called Mnemonology, and they go all to great lengths to say, oh, well, we never used the memory techniques ourselves because our subjective experience would poison our objective analysis. Now, I've always thought that was kind of BS, but I guess I get it in one sense. But also, since that time, people like Boris Conrad, who is a memory competitor and a very impressive one, he is also a neuroscientist, and he has participated in writing one of the most important articles on memory in Neuron. So it's possible to be objective about what memory techniques are and aren't, and still be a user of them, right? And I think Tony Buzan was a great person who said and exemplified how that you could understand the memory science and bridge it together with the use of memory techniques. And so during his Think Buzan seminars, he used to have students draw out the forgetting curve in their own handwriting with multiple colors, and it was just the most beautiful thing in the world. And he called it the most important graph of the world. And if you want to come and look up the forgetting curve on the Magnetic Memory Method website, you can see my drawing from a Think Buzan event where I took a photo of it, and I still have it somewhere. And it just shows in detail not just the forgetting curve, but the primacy effect, the recency effect, the von Restorff effect, all these wonderful, beautiful effects that are just wonderful words that you could use memory techniques to memorize. And so basically, I think that what happens is that a lot of people, they get themselves all caught up in this anxiety because they're reading about all these effects, never memorizing anything using memory techniques, and it's like they're swimming while refusing to get wet, and they want it to be perfect, as if you could ever swim without getting wet. I mean, you've got to sometimes accidentally inhale water when you learn to swim. I mean, maybe there's some perfect person who never has any problems when learning to swim, but in memory techniques, you can't sit there and learn all this stuff and have it delay your progress or cause anxiety or fears that you're going to get certain things wrong, right? This is very, very important not to do any such thing to yourself. Please just dive in, take action. Because there may be such a thing that you could call, too much scientific literacy. I don't really think so, but I think often of Tony Buzan, who told me years ago that, whatever you do, don't tell people about the memory science. And I resisted this because I'm so interested in memory science, and studying memory science has helped me discover many, many powerful activities. I've read about various brain exercises that scientists have put together in labs and so forth. And really the problem, like I mentioned, is that about a year and a half ago, people, young people in particular, but not just young people, they just started writing to me using all of this scientific language. And, a medical student in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass emailed me some time ago, about 6 weeks ago, repeatedly with this and that from memory science and worrying about the decay function and that the primacy effect and the recency effect were going to be perfectly timed in order to have absolute crystal clear memory of everything. And Lorraine's warning was starting to take on a strange and unexpected meaning that, something is happening to people where they are allowing scientific vocabulary to replace their practice with memory techniques. And they're ultimately turning memory into a magic bullet that it is not. And that's not what the science is ever saying. Besides which, the science is there mostly to describe, not to proscribe what you're supposed to do. Now we can, again, find, as I have found, elements in the science literature that help us improve our practice, but it is not useful to let the techniques that have been succeeding happily for thousands of years become a source of worry, concern, or hindrance, obstacle No, 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 we don't want that. That's not what scientific papers are written for. Not at all. So, and this is just a memory blip coming here, but if you want to see where obstruction can be useful, there's a Lars von Trier movie called The Five Obstructions, which I highly recommend. It's a bit unrelated, but the beauty of podcasting is that you can have these little detours and mention things to people. And so if you haven't seen The Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier, I highly recommend that you take it up. And it's not just because it shows how constraints and following rules can be useful, but it's also a kind of homage to one's inspiration and how you can get revenge on your own inspirations sometimes. So maybe Harry Lorraine is getting revenge on me because I have talked about memory science and I'm talking about it now because I love it. But, in a way, I don't know how much that I've created the problem that I now need to solve. And, it's not just beginners who come to me with all of this scientific verbiage when they contact me. I just heard from somebody the other day, a published researcher who's reasoned himself into a genuine paradox. I mean, amongst other things he was emailing me about, he was saying that, or he wanted to know how much I can remember without using any memory techniques. And I just said, this is not possible to answer, right? Because someone who has trained their memory is not going to be able to isolate a raw baseline without risking cognitive paradox. Is that the right way I want to say this? I mean, basically what I'm saying is that I would have to reflect on my not using methods in order to not use them. And that would cause me to think about using memory methods. And so it would it's just like the old don't think of a red cat kind of thing. So to sit down and try to remember something without using a technique to remember it would essentially be impossible. In this particular case, with this particular individual, they're a published researcher, but he even told me, he's just like, nobody reads my stuff, which I thought was a nice admission. But then he came back after I told him, I can't answer your question. He said, oh, but by the way, photographic memory is real and blah, blah, blah. And photographic memory has been so thoroughly debunked so many times. And if you look into its history, which I have reported on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast before, the term photographic memory itself makes zero sense. If anything, the people who have these kinds of extraordinary memory that we call photographic memory, they deserve better than that word photographic. It's just, it doesn't reflect what's going on at all. So this is where some nuance about the forgetting curve can be really, really helpful to the serious user of memory techniques. Not only do we have to put aside the words forgetting curve and photographic memory and all this stuff and just get into the practice, but when we are going to use those words, we should know that the things that they're pointing to have been in existence for a very, very long time. So let's turn to Aristotle, because Aristotle described the core principle, or at least he nudged in the direction of it and solved it a long time ago. So he would put a primacy on actually studying and using memory techniques. And, he wanted you to become a psychologist of your own mind. And just by taking action, and, he used the idea of your memory being like an aviary, and you got to go in there and take care of the birds in the aviary. And this is actually going and doing, not just studying. And Aristotle, of course, was a great student of the world and an analyzer of all kinds of things and a theorist and whatnot. But he still took care of his memory to actually use it, right? And so that's really important. And in De Memoria, he talks, which is, on memory, he describes recollection as movement through an ordered series of pieces of information. And at one point in this book, De Memoria, he uses a sequence like the letters of the alphabet and literally lists the letter of the alphabet. And he gives this striking piece of advice that is very, very much like what I call recall rehearsal. And in fact, recall rehearsal, as I started to practice, it was directly inspired by its description in Aristotle. So what is recall rehearsal? Well, it's a form of spaced repetition when it's applied specifically to the memory palace technique. We'll talk a little bit about what it is later. But as Aristotle puts it, if you forget something, and he says, if you're struggling to recall something, don't start over from the beginning of the piece of information. Enter it in the middle. This is where I think he's talking about memory palaces. And let me just backtrack a little bit and share how one of the best scholars of Aristotle's work on memory is Richard Sorabji. And in Aristotle on Memory, I highly recommend reading this book. He says, I have no idea what Aristotle's talking about with this enter the alphabet in the middle kind of stuff, right? But as a practitioner of memory techniques who's used memory palaces and knows about numbered memory palaces and lettered memory palaces and navigating memory palaces in different orders, I was just like, hot damn, he's talking about beating the forgetting curve. That's literally what he's saying. And so, or at least I think that he's literally saying that. Ultimately, I have to say, I don't know myself because I don't know that, well, first of all, these are Aristotle's lecture notes, probably nothing that he wrote himself. Not only that, but there are incomplete passages in the book. And also, I mean, he doesn't, as far as I know, literally say the word memory palace. But nonetheless, he's talking about sequential information. And so even if he's not talking about a memory palace where you have literally said that station A is the first station in the memory palace and on, right? He's still talking about ordered information and then navigating it in linear fashion, but in a nonlinear way as well. So that may have inspired other mnemonists to letter their memory palace stations. In any case, I don't fully know enough about the history of the Greek alphabet and what is sometimes, described as how these ancient alphabets always referred to a number and an animal at the same time, which, you can see in the letter A very much looks like, or if you study the history of the letter A, it's like an ox's head upside down or shifted around. Aleph in Hebrew is like this. And in Hebrew, you have the gematria, which is very, very rigidly and specifically every letter having a number and an animal or an object of some sort. And so that's a mnemonic technique. And that's probably one of the earliest origins of where we get the PAO. In the Indian tradition, there's the Katapayati, which is very similar. But again, I can't say 100% for sure that Aristotle is saying use a memory palace, but he's still describing this idea of destroying the forgetting curve. When you have trouble, don't start at the beginning over and over and over again, because that's what creates primacy effect. And then that situation where you can remember the beginning of a poem very, very easily, but you drop out in the middle, or you can never get to the end, or you also remember the end of the poem fairly well, but you can't do the middle. I have this experience right now with something that I'm memorizing, and I haven't finished the very final poem in a sequence of poems from Christian Bach's Eunoia, but I can tell you what the last words are, because the recency effect just tells us that we'll remember the beginning and the end of something far better than the middle. And so what I need to do is use the memory palace to give primacy and recency to each and every part of that poem. And I can do about 350 words of it now, and I still have, well, probably closer to 400, and I still have the last 50 words of this last poem to go. But because of these effects, I know what the end of the poem says, even though I never even memorized it. I just glanced at it, and I know exactly what's in there, right? That's just a crazy, interesting effect. But in order to memorize it, I have to use recall rehearsal. Again, I'll get into it a little bit more later on in this episode. But rest assured that Aristotle kicked something off somehow. And so Peter of Rowena in the Phoenix talks about these kinds of things. Jacobus Publicius talks about it. And both Publicius and Peter of Rowena, they talk about doing this kind of enter in the middle inside of words themselves. So it's not just that you would enter in the middle of a memory palace in order to help get better retention of information going forward and backward, but enter into the middle of words to help you remember them better, which is beautiful. And I later, started to call this, how I do it in language learning, the principle of word division. And so, we all have to come up with new terms, I guess, or we don't, but I don't find a term in Rowena or Publicius that really name what it is they're talking about. So I just called it the principle of word division. And that's been very, very useful. Now, Robert Flood, to a lesser extent, gets into this kind of stuff. And Giordano Bruno is hook, line, and sinker into it like never before. He goes into granular detail, just bonkers. And the reality is the results that you get out of it are also very, very strong because of what Bruno brought to the game. In any case, what we also have is a little bit of the dark side, which is that there are people in the world who don't use these techniques, and then they say things about them that convince others and confuse others, one of whom being the otherwise beautiful and delightful and wonderful Frances Yates, who wrote The Art of Memory. If you look at the cover of one of her editions of The Art of Memory, she has a memory wheel that she drew, and as a practitioner, I look at it and I just think, what on earth is she thinking? And I don't mean to be overly critical, but it's just, listen, she herself admitted, I never actually used these techniques. And then when she's talking about reproducing the memory wheel, I don't know what she's doing. Like, it's just the strangest memory wheel I've ever seen, because she seems to think that the memory wheel is a kind of memory palace, which it's not. It's a generator of mnemonics, and amongst other things. It's just its own big world. But the idea of the memory wheel as a memory palace unto itself, I just can't see it that way. Maybe. I mean, you could certainly use it that way if you wanted, but it would be very challenging. I wouldn't do it myself. In any case, the thing is that this is a very, very powerful way of defeating the forgetting curve, using memory palaces in combination with some of the effects that Ebbinghaus found reduced or impacted positively the forgetting curve, so you forgot less. And if you were going to re-memorize things and have savings, as he called it, then you're going to be able to spend much, much less time re-memorizing things. Now, I don't like to re-memorize things if I don't have to. There are certain Bach pieces that I've learned for bass guitar that I didn't play for a number of years, and I had to re-memorize them. And, that's frankly a little bit of a pain in the butt. It's worth it in the end, but it's a bit of a pain. But one thing that I did kind of like, I don't know how you would say this, casually, I wasn't trying to reproduce anything that Ebbinghaus did, but I memorized a number of Sanskrit mantras. And one of them I just deliberately stopped. And then after 2 years of not working with it, and I worked with it for a couple of years, I just suddenly started to recall it. And it is astonishing how much that I remembered of it. Now, I didn't beat the forgetting curve totally, but I damaged it. I put a dent in it, because it is bizarre how much of it was waiting for me. Now, I have reacquired the specific book that I memorized the extracts from. This is the Song Celestial. And one of the reasons I stopped it is because the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song Celestial, is extracted from the Bhagavad Gita, and somehow it just didn't fully resonate with me as much as my other Sanskrit phrases did, so I kind of just let it trail off. But still, it's just wild. I close my eyes and I can still recall so much of it. And it sounds really great. I don't know why I stopped. It's like, idam shariram kaunteya kshetram iti abhidyate etad yo veritam prahukshetrajna etitad vidaha shetrajna yo yanam yattad yanam matamama ahim atma gudakesha sarva bhuta asyata amadis cha madhyam cha bhutanam anta eva cha. Anyway, I can go on further than that. And it's still bizarre to me that I can remember that after I just let it drop for approximately 2 years. So I don't know, if I re-memorize some parts of it, maybe I can be more deliberate in tracking how many savings that I get. But the reality is I use memory techniques in the first place. So I'm already encoding it a lot faster than rote, right? Now, the other thing, though, however, that needs to be considered here is that because I still recited all my other Sanskrit mantras, probably a part of why that is coming along for the ride so easily, or easily in a way that astonishes me, is because I maintained the other Sanskrit. Now, there's a principle called context-dependent memory, and I think that's a huge part of what makes the rest come along so easily, that I have left aside. Because if I compare this to my film studies career, I hardly watch movies anymore. Like maybe I watch 2 movies a month. And sometimes I just watch movies and just skip through them to get through the point because I'm just not that interested in movies anymore, strangely enough. And I don't read theoretical movies about film theory or film history anymore. And I certainly don't lecture for weeks on end during a standard semester. So this has de-skilled my film scholar chops. I'm just not that great at it anymore. I mean, I can come up with certain concepts and, analyze a movie if I want, but I just am not the same way, right? I don't have the context anymore. It's just really weird how that works. So it's a lesson, though. If you want to remember more and maintain more, what you really need to do is stay inside of certain contexts. Now, in terms of recall rehearsal and seeing it in action, the key, first of all, is to understand the memory palace technique. We're not going to go into the memory palace technique today. You can search up magnetic memory method and memory palace for the complete guide to the memory palace technique, or come and get the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com. Go through it. There's videos. There's worksheets to complete. And to this day, I'm always delighted when people send me their memory palace homework, and I'm always happy to comment on it if you want to complete it. But one of the best places to see it in action is to watch my case study of how Anthony Hopkins memorizes his scripts, which I tried to reproduce. And, sometimes I criticize people for giving up too early, but I just stopped doing his style quite quickly and went back to memorizing the way that I do it. But the reality is that I wasn't going to get anywhere with it because I'm not Anthony Hopkins and I don't have any movie deals. And as much as I sometimes think that would be fun to be an actor, I don't know. I mean, the hard work that goes into doing all those auditions and so forth, I don't know. I mean, I admire actors very, very much because it's not just that they do a lot of hard work to study scripts and develop character and so forth, but how much work you have to go through just to get into the field. Wow, it's amazing. In any case, what I did is I shared in the video version of taking on Anthony Hopkins' memory ritual, I recited the Shakespeare I have memorized out of order. And I did it in front of a live audience, so there's a clip. So if you want to watch that, you can see how that the various serial positioning patterns that Ebbinghaus noticed, they help with that. Because I can go right into the middle, as Aristotle would say, and give you the line. Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? And then I can skip the line after that and go over here and go over there. It's a beautiful passage too. It's from Titus Andronicus, and basically it goes, I haven't recited it for a while, so here's a good test. Why, I have not another tear to shed. Besides, this sorrow is an enemy and would usurp upon my watery eyes and make them blind with tributary tears. Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? For these 2 heads do seem to speak to me, and threaten me I shall never come to bliss, till this mischief be returned again, even in the throats that committed them. In any case, to do it backwards, I have to think about each individual station, and I have to think about it more the more distant these lines get from me. But, it's like, even in the throats that committed them, till this mischief be returned again, and threaten me that I shall never come to bliss. These 2 heads do seem to speak to me. Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? And so on. I think I'm a little too tired to go through the whole thing right now, but also I have to prepare for a law school presentation that I'm giving tomorrow. I've already written the speech, and I basically memorized it, but I'm going to do another pass and so forth. So I'll save a little bit of my cognitive energy. But if I were going to repeat it with the odd numbered lines and the even numbered lines, I think it's, why, I have not another tear to shed, and would usurp upon my watery eyes, and then which way shall I find revenge's cave? And you skip around like that, and that's what the memory palace technique lets you do. And it, the forgetting curve is taking hold. I can feel it now. I wasn't expecting it to take as much hold as it has, but at the end of the day, it's just wild how much of it I can still do, jumping between sections, forward and backward and so forth. And Do I have any context help? Yeah, well, I memorize poetry all the time. Like I'm working on, as I mentioned, and I can remember, parts of it that I haven't even memorized yet, even just a little couple words because of the recency effect. But that's a really hard one. And something about working with it, I think, just strengthens the practice overall. But the reality is that even in context, you still have to do the real thing. And that's a bit annoying because, people email me all the time. This is going to get easier. And yes, it gets easier, but you still ultimately wind up in a situation where, you're going to have different energies at different times of day and all that sort of stuff. So how you beat the curve, you have to factor in things like time of day. And this time of day is probably not the best time of day to do podcasting, but because I'm so busy with law school right now, it's either now or never. And here we are. And I would rather serve and keep the Magnetic Memory Method project going than skip longer periods of time than necessary. And, I don't ever try to portray memory techniques as being perfect, but rather better memory. And certainly I have enjoyed that far beyond what I ever thought was possible. It's amazing. And I'm not alone. I think often of students like Jeannie Coe, who wrote years ago about how she was struggling with Greek and for scriptural memory purposes. And she just spent years of what she described as tears and pain trying to get this memorized. But then she started to use memory techniques and these processes, and away she went. She was able to get a lot more memorized with much, much greater recall. And there's lots and lots of success stories on the Magnetic Memory Method testimonials page if you want to search up Magnetic Memory Method and testimonials. Now, at the end of the day, one problem I see is that people want to measure their progress and they want someone to just give them a means of measuring their progress. Well, this is where Ebbinghaus's lesson, I think, is so valuable. I don't believe there's one way to measure your progress. And how I use memory journaling is not something I'm going to turn into a system. I talk about this in The Victorious Mind. People have asked me about a memory journal that I would create for them, and I've mocked them up, but I never pulled the trigger on getting a designer to design them and design a cover. I actually have talked about it a little bit with a designer, but I never pulled the trigger on, ordering the work because I keep getting stopped. In the same way I get stopped with an app. The art of memory is got to have you involved in the process. And I think that's what the real story of Ebbinghaus is all about. He did the memorization. He journaled out how he was experiencing rates of decay. And then he found the saving principle by re-memorizing. Really, it's just keeping a journal, right? I've got all kinds of journals. I think I would just confuse people if I got into this journal and then this one over here, if you're watching the video version of the podcast I'm recording now, and then there's this journal over here, and that's just not even the half of them. They're not all in reach, but I have so many journals, and there's no system per se that I would expect anybody to reproduce, but build your own. Really what it comes down to is memorize, test your memory, and track and check how that you're doing, and then think about how to improve your practice. And I find that there's always challenges. Really, my challenges are time of day choices or memorizing names in noisy rooms. That causes problems, right? But if you're a memory competitor or you want to be one, check out my podcast conversation with Johannes Malo. He explains how he used journaling in a much more rigorous way for the purposes of succeeding at memory competition. But just dive in and start, read Ebbinghaus if you want and get some clues there, but build your own practice with journaling and build your own experiments by picking something. Now, one thing that I can tell you about forgetting is that I think in most people's lives, outside of laboratory studies of forgetting, I think it's a crisis of commitment. People are just not 100% in. And I see it over and over and over again. People email me and say, I just don't know what to memorize. So If you'd like help with that, I created something called the system, which you can get at magneticmemorymethod.com/TS. TS for the system. And what it is an hour-long training where I take you through a medieval and Renaissance learning system, but I've modernized it, and it will give you categories that I think are very, very, very useful and powerful to select for your memory goals. And, you might come up with ideas for other categories. But if you want to have a system to follow, you just take those categories and you create a semester. It can be an 8-week semester, a 12-week semester, a 22-week semester, whatever it is, right? You get out a memory journal and then you just stick with those topics. Because if you want context-dependent memory, sticking with 3 to 5 topics and rotating them before you add another 4 or 5 topics, or maybe you scale down to 2 topics, etc. If you keep rotating within these really, really small areas, you're gonna remember more because of context-dependent memory effects that will also help beat the forgetting curve in addition to memory techniques, right? And I know from my studies in polymathy that learning multiple techniques at some level literally means focusing very, very much on a few things to get them into orbit before you move on to the next. And there's only so many you can do at the same time. And this is something I have to think about a lot with my current law degree project thing. I'm not sure it's a thing. I don't know what it is. But forgetting is often a crisis of commitment. And that's a really, really important thing. And one thing we have to ask with Ebbinghaus is, what was he committed to? Well, he was committed to psychology, to experimental psychology. And that may have assisted part of his ability to do it, right? Passion, interest. And so keep in mind that if you're forgetting, you might be forgetting because you're studying for a qualification you don't really want. Your parents want you to have it, or a partner wants you to have it. You can't, please other people. Very rarely is that going to be pleasing to you. I mean, you can get pleasure out of pleasing other people if you're resonant with what you're doing. If you're a novelist who pleases other people and you love writing novels, well, bang presto, right? That's being deeply aligned, as they say in some of the self-help worlds, alignment. But I think it's absolutely true. I think so many people don't have problems with memory or memory techniques. They have problems with a conflict of purpose. And I'm starting to feel this already in my first trimester with law. I could not know in advance what studying law was really going to be about. No amount of reading this, that, or the other thing would have been a replacement for sitting in actual class, or at least better said, in the actual classes with the actual university that I decided to go with, right? And the saving grace in my doubt now that I'm going to continue with it at all is that I have greater insight into what's involved. And so now I have to ask a different question. Just because I'm a mnemonist who can memorize Latin quite quickly, and I can probably get my presentation that I have to give tomorrow memorized by the end of today and review it a little bit tomorrow morning if I want to, but I could probably just do it tomorrow as long as I'm well rested. It doesn't mean I have to pursue the entire degree. It doesn't mean I have to pursue every possible thing that I'm interested in. The ability to remember, does not prove that it deserves years of my life if I've decided that this really isn't for me. So I think this is one of the great things that, assuming things go well, technological innovation is going to bring for us. People are going to be able to spend more time on what they really want to do. At least that's my hope. But we're not there yet. And so until that time comes, I think you'd be well served to go through my system course at magneticmemorymethod.com/TS for the system. And it'll give you some ideas. And I think if you resonate with those things and you come into alignment with some of those topics and you really rotate through a tight set and you add memory techniques, I think you're going to defeat the forgetting curve in ways that you can't even imagine are possible. And then in terms of maintenance, Well, you don't have to maintain all things forever. My friend Jonathan Levy once told me, he said, some things are for a season, some things are for a reason, and some things are for a life. And none of us has to know which is which. We don't even have to accept that cliche if we don't want to. But as Gilles Deleuze once said, the war against cliches is a terrible thing. I like cliche, quite frankly, because there's truth in most cliches. So, you can allow yourself to be really well versed and have very strong memory in certain things, like I did with film studies, for a season in your life. And it doesn't have to remain forever in order for you to get massive amounts of fulfillment out of it for a certain period. In all things, once you have a learning goal that you love, keep a journal as you memorize, use the magnetic memory method, and do it not to reproduce a 19th century experiment by Hermann Ebbinghaus. Don't do it to destroy the forgetting curve. Don't do it to get hung up on all kinds of scientific terms that create some perfectionism that you're never going to stand up to. Do it for the love of memory and the fulfillment that comes from being able to recall things better, because that is what will keep your memory magnetic. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Oh, I forgot. I wanted to always include a question segment here. So we're not done yet. We got a few more minutes to go. So David, he said, I want to know more about you. What's your next goal? Or if that's too personal, what's your favorite book? Or if that's too general, what's the book you've most enjoyed writing? So that's from David, and I love that. Thank you for wanting to know more about me. Well, my next goal is to get my bookshop finished, my physical Memory Palace bookshop. And that came into some unexpected trouble that has extended the project for much longer than I ever thought it would go, and with much more darkness than I ever thought was possible. Those matters will be discussed, I'm sure, at some point, even if they are not discussed in some direct way. I don't know yet exactly how they're going to get discussed, or maybe never at all. But in any case, very interesting. Let's just say it was very interesting indeed. But that's my goal, is to get that done. And, part of entering law school was that I had to wait. I was in a hurry up and wait position. I don't know if you know that term. I learned it in high school about the war. Soldiers were told to hurry up and wait, before advancing on the enemy and all that sort of stuff. That's very much what I felt like over the last couple months. And it's crazy how difficult things got, but I kept persevering and getting back to progress. And it's not the way I want it to be, and there's going to be more issues to deal with, but nonetheless, I'm glad that I could find the inner perseverance and that my love of memory itself kept me going, and I really appreciate all the support of all the people that are a part of the Magnetic Memory Method world. So thank you very much for that. And I want to have a place you can come visit if you are so inclined to come to Australia, and all of the things that are involved in this project, because I have the idea of a different kind of memory competition. I've been building, as some of you know, various games. And to that end, the other question was that, what's my favorite book? Or if that's too general, what's the book that I most enjoyed writing? I think it's not possible for me to say what my favorite book is. Probably the book that impacted my life the most, that took it in a direction I never saw coming, is Gary Weber's Happiness Beyond Thought, but also Evolving Beyond Thought. Can't divide the two. Whether you get such results, I don't know. But as I talked about in The Victorious Mind, that just took me off in a whole different direction. And I'm still surprised by the direction that it opened up, especially since I was a person who resisted that kind of stuff for a very long time. But in terms of the book that I most enjoyed writing, probably, even though they were a royal pain in the backside, the two memory detective novels, the three, because I've drafted the finale for the Memory Detective series. But the first one is called Flyboy, the second is called Vitamin X, and the third is called Vicious Slaughter. And Vicious Slaughter, I don't know how long it's going to take for me to finish it. It is finished, but Vitamin X went through 9 drafts, and Vicious Slaughter has gone through 2 drafts, and I need to rewrite a lot of Vicious Slaughter because of what happened with Vitamin X, because the plan for Vitamin X got changed just due to some stuff that was going on in life, and it was just like too obvious that I have to loop in some of this stuff that's going on in life, and Vicious Slaughter is very similar in that regard. But those are probably my favorite projects, and then the other favorite project is probably Bruno Reborn. And thanks to everybody who was part of that, I'll probably re-release another version and do another live version of Bruno Code that comes along with Bruno Reborn. And it is a lot of fun to finally have done something on Bruno. I have a draft of a book called The Infinite Memory Palace Technique of Giordano Bruno, and I've never hit it exactly the way that I want. And it might just be a project that I leave unfinished in favor of doing more of the Bruno Reborn style, because I think it may be a better and truer way of sharing with you what I've learned from Bruno than some kind of textbook, and then doing more of the live events and boot camps. So speaking of boot camps, if you want to be notified, one of the best ways to get notified of when new boot camps are coming, if you want to show up live for some memory training, make sure you start with the system. Understand what's going on there. And that you can grab at magneticmemorymethod.com/TS for the system. And I think you'll be well served. I've had so many amazing emails from people who have gone through the system. They were surprised. A lot of them have heard of these things before, but never quite in this way. And many have never, ever heard of what I'm talking about. And they're just like, where has this been my entire life? It's so clear. It's so clean. It's so crisp. It's such a powerful direction to follow. And the value of it is on its face even before you get started. So magneticmemorymethod.com/TS for the system. Again, forgetting curve. You can really, really make a dent in it. Can you permanently defeat it? I don't know. That's up to you to find out. But for me, I've always been delighted. It is my delight that keeps me going to continue doing the magnetic memory method stuff. It's just driven by bliss of being able to recall anything, let alone thousands of words now in Sanskrit. And then how many words total, I don't know, but just the stuff I'm doing with Eunoia now, it's a very difficult poem, or at least I find it very challenging. And I think when I'm done, it's 480 words in total. And it's just, unknown to me how long I'll retain it if I don't repeat it regularly enough. But the adventure is what this is all about, and the bliss and the joy that comes along with it as you memorize. So thank you again, and send me your questions. I'll cover them to the best of my ability. Sometimes I have to remind myself, of course, to do it, but I really appreciate hearing from you. And until we have a chance to speak again, thank you again, and keep yourself magnetic.